everyone. Overall, it was another great week of reading responses. Great job. And I always enjoy teaching a book like this because students rarely get to read environmental history unless you take a specialized course on environmental history. And when we get to the research phase, you actually have an option to pursue an environmental history topic. And so before we get started, get into the next book, let's talk about some of the questions for last week. And so most of you got the central argument of the book, and I gave everyone just the point for an attempt, even if you got it wrong. And so for those of you who struggled, I just want to point out 2 times where he identifies the argument. And one is here, early in the preface. And you can see he's nice. He gives you this big red flag by writing, my argument is. And so, it can't get any clearer, right? And so he writes, my argument is not simply that natural disasters bear a strong human component, but those in power, politicians, federal, state, and city policymakers, and corporate leaders have tended to view these events as purely natural in an effort to justify a set of responses that have proved both environmentally unsound and socially, if not morally, bankrupt. And so there's another spot in the introduction where he, again, gives you a red flag by writing, I argue. And so it's right here. And so again, this is sort of the red flags I want you to look for when we read these next 2 books. And so in our next 2 books, I want you to continue to look for that central argument as you read. And so another important question dealt with the different approaches to history. And I asked you to explain environmental, social, and cultural history. And most of you did a great job. And so in case you missed it, here is the spot where he gives you a brief overview. And so here he explains that environmental history is concerned with the interaction between human beings and nature, that social history is concerned with questions of power, and cultural history is concerned with issues of meaning and interpretation. And so, a few of you found this section, many of you found this section, but some of you actually mixed up social history and cultural history, so just take another look at that right here. Because social and cultural history is going to be so useful for us once we get into the research part of the course, I want to spend a bit more time on this. So let's talk about social history for a moment. If you've taken an upper level history course before, a professor might have used the term to reference studying race, social class, gender, sexual identity, right? That's an important part of social history. One of the fundamental assumptions of social history is that identity matters, right? When we're studying U.S. history, not all Americans experience the world in the same way, right? Your race, class, gender, sexual identity can help explain a person's experience. And so one of the goals behind this is to try to understand power, right? And that's why Steinberg writes that social history is concerned with questions of power. All of those identities that I listed help us figure out who has more power than others and why people have more power than others. And so this plays out in the book when he identifies people with wealth who exercise an incredible amount of power over public policy. He also uses social history to identify the poor and people, how the poor and people of color usually suffer the most from these public policies during disasters. And one of the terms that we often use when we're using social history is called agency. And agency basically refers to how much power a person or a group of people have over their own lives. Nobody has 0 power over their own life, but nobody has full control over their life either. And so when we're figuring out why people make certain choices, we're always asking, what are the kind of constraints that people are working within? And you can see that that working when Steinberg tries to explain why poor folks are often living in zones that are most ravaged by natural disasters. If we all had full agency over our lives, you could simply argue that it's their fault for living there, that they just shouldn't live there in the first place. And so, but Steinberg tries to point out that there are many factors that restrict their agency and he tries to explain why poor folks are living in these particular areas. The other approach I want to spend some more time on is cultural history. And so here he defines cultural history as concerned with meaning and interpretation. And it's important that you understand what he's trying to say here. So when we study cultural history, we're trying to figure out how the people we're studying interpreted or try to get other people to interpret their experience, which could be completely disconnected, right, from what really happened. You can see this when Steinberg talks about the script of natural disasters. And you can see one of those moments, if I go down here on page 22, where he writes, starting here, the trend towards seeing these events as merely freak natural acts has helped people to paper over the human role in them. At times depriving Americans the chance to shape their own culture's destiny. So in the book, when he talks about people seeing events as freak natural acts, he's using cultural history. It's an example of people at the time giving meaning or their own interpretation to understanding their experience. Right? He's trying to show in the book that this interpretation is wrong, that these are just freak natural acts. But cultural historians are as interested in what people at the time get wrong as much as what they get right. Right? Cultural history was also at work in the first book that we read. Remember that the popular history of the civil rights movement is an effort to interpret and give meaning to the civil rights movement. Most of that interpretation, as that author pointed out, was wrong, but because that incorrect interpretation has consequences, it's worth studying. Right? And so this week we're going to look for those social and cultural approaches in our next book. That's Beth Bailey's America's Army, which looks at the rise and consequences of an all-volunteer army in the U.S. And so in addition to trying to figure out the argument, I'm challenging you in the reading responses when you look there to find one example where Bailey uses the social history approach and one example where Bailey uses the cultural history approach. And I'm giving points just for effort here, so don't freak out if you think you might be off base. And so when I upload the next video, I'll report on how everyone did. So remember, you can always contact me with questions, but enjoy the reading this week.